Hello, everyone. My name is Isabelle Pethtel, and today I'm presenting my analysis on the transformative archive of our own, aka AO3, specifically fandom growth and decline and its causes. Today, I hope to adequately define and describe what fanfiction is and AO3's history. From there, I'll provide an overview of AO3's metrics as of the 2021 release dataset. Afterwards, I will examine the timelines of select fandoms to gauge their lifespans up to the year 2021, identifying peaks in popularity versus interest wane. This information will be used to predict the current status of these fandoms from 2021 to 2025 and potential future trends. Finally, I will end with a comparison of my findings to determine fandom engagement as a reflection for media prevalence and popularity. My motivation is pretty simple. I started reading fanfiction back in 2011 due to a little known anime called Wolf's Rain, and after the 2012 Hobbit movie came out, that's when I found AO3. I've always been interested in fandom and how it derives solely from fan appreciation for the source material, but even as a casual reader or writer of the site, I've noticed that it can be indicative of popular media's prevalence and lasting nature. But what even is fanfiction and why does it even matter? Fan lore defines fanfiction as a work of fiction written by fans for other fans. A couple years ago, I would have described it as God's given mission to writers to fix what the last season of Game of Thrones broke. Exact definitions vary by where you refer, but the term fanfiction itself is relatively new in the grand scheme, especially considering the meaning and idea behind it has defined stories for our span of history. Shakespeare's famous plays reimagined classical myths or rewrote the stories of real people. And Arthurian legend consists mostly of fan interpretations that became so popular they were considered canon. Modern day fanfiction is more prevalent, especially as access to the stories we know and love has become easier right alongside access to archives like AO3. The nature of fanfiction makes it an insightful gauge for IP demand and lastingness, as well as when or what draws in the most fan engagement with the source material. If people love a piece of media so much they're writing 300,000 word novels about it, then that says something. And it says it even louder when it happens again and again and again. And now on to my Power BI dashboard. Starting off, I felt it useful to share some general metrics for the archive as a whole. Do keep in mind that this data is mostly from 2021 and does not reflect current numbers, which are more than doubled. Some of our most important metrics we'll be looking at today we can see here. The average amount of words per fic is around 7,000, but the full word count was over 52 billion across more than 7 million works. 7 million stories, averaging 7,000 per story, totaling in 52 billion words. And these numbers have more than doubled in the last 5 years. The most populous language used in the archive is English by far. In terms of completed works versus incomplete works, the majority are completed, surprisingly. With the scatter plot over here, we can compare the number of works within a fandom versus their average word count. So, for example, looking down at our heat map of the 10 largest fandoms, Harry Potter, the biggest fandom by and large on AO3, has over 270,000 works with an average word count of about 10,000. Starting off with specific analysis, we're taking a look at the 2005 mystery series Supernatural. Here we have the fandom name, its number of works, and its word count, and above we can see its timeline from the inception of AO3 to the end of the dataset in 2021. I've plotted out the release of every single season premiere, plus the airing of the final episode to better showcase its lifespan. While there is some growth in the early days of AO3, it isn't until season 8 that we get our first big jump, leading into what I'd consider the fandom's golden era. After that, we begin to see a decline, followed by a couple of immense peaks after season premieres and at that final episode release. We can see that it typically takes about 2 months or so after the release of its season to see that season surge. That's most likely due to the weekly nature release of episodes. With the end of Supernatural in 2020, however, it is almost a given that the fandom will start to wane. Here we can see a new timeline for the fandom from 2021 to 2025 with the latest data scraped from AO3. And sure enough, there's been a dramatic decrease in fics posted by month, leveling out at about 1,000. In the last 5 years, only 64,000 works have been released compared to the nearly 300,000 before. Supernatural seems to be coasting, and I think that part of it steadying at 1K instead of lower is due to its solidification as a cult classic. I don't really see a revival coming anytime soon, however, without media to prompt it, and Winchester's wasn't really able to do that. Next up is Harry Potter, by and large the biggest to this day fandom on AO3. In 2021, it had over 270,000 works and over 3 billion word counts. The timeline above shows its steady incline in the early years, already with numbers cementing it as a top fandom. But the spikes after the release of The Cursed Child and Fantastic Beasts 1 shook things up for a couple months. Fantastic Beasts 2 didn't get the same hype, but that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is that even taking into account COVID stay at homes and the across the board rise in fanfiction during the 2020 era, Harry Potter fics suddenly surge up with no new source media to prompt as much. This, I speculate, was in part retaliation of fans against Rowling as her first transphobic comments were posted online, leading to a lot of outrage. One thing that gives fandom a lot of its prevalence is its ability to tell LGBTQIA plus narratives that are a lot of the time overlooked or passed over in canon. Fandom has always been a safe space to tell the kinds of stories that get underrepresented in modern media. So I have to wonder if this incline isn't fans fighting back against hate, but making more of what they love despite as much. When we look at the new scrape data, though, we see something even more mind boggling. Even with the release of a third Fantastic Beasts movie, even with the introduction of a new open world RPG, and even with the most recent announcement of a new Harry Potter show upcoming, there's been no big or one to one media release to adequately predicate the massive rise in popularity the fandom has undergone in the last 5 years. We can see that 2021 to 2025 has almost the same amount of works as the decades before it as a whole. Now, this is what I consider zombification. There's no real or straightforward reason for the fandom that was slightly in decline before COVID to rocket up like this, except it has become such a household name. It has solidified itself in consumer consciousness with websites, with Universal Studios, with theme parks and rides and nostalgia, until it is feeding off itself so much that it's come back from what might have been its decline. Hence, zombification, which is actually pretty neat to see. Third up, we have The Lord of the Rings, including the Hobbit movies and so on. Now, this is an old fandom that had communities before there was even an internet to be a fan community on, but it never got the same popularity as Harry Potter. For the most part, the fandom as a whole is coasting. No real growth except for the 2010s when the Jackson Hobbit movies made the stage and we see our first bumps in popularity resulting in a mini revival, especially since it was followed very closely by the Hassett import, which was another Tolkien fanfic archive that was about to be removed until it was all imported to AO3. But even with that, interest did slow off. Knowing, however, from a future perspective about the most recent Amazon series Rings of Power, I predicted another minor revival ahead. And sure enough, that's what we see here. We jumped from less than 400 to over 800 fics per month with the release of season 2. And even with the current trend on the decline, I think some of that interest will remain a little while longer until we get season 3. Depending on how long the series plans to go, I think we'll continue to see these bumps in interest coinciding with season releases, but ultimately I feel like the Lord of the Rings fandom will fall back into that coasting decline. Unless we somehow get another blockbuster movie, especially with Jackson. So Merlin, I'm looking at you. Finally, we have the Star Wars fandom, which is both old and new. Old in the sense that Episode 4 came out in the 70s, new in the sense that it's in its renaissance. And best of all, we can see that Star Wars renaissance firsthand here with our timelines. At first, we see little to no growth at all, despite the Clone Wars series being periodically released. And then wham, 2016, we get our first sequel movie, and people remember that Star Wars is cool. The next two movies are released within 2 years of each other, catching the fandom before it can fall into decline. And with the right mixture of COVID, movie releases, and the excitement for Mandalorian Season 1, the fandom got sent to new heights. The real question, however, is can they stay there? The answer is they're sure trying. I'd consider us still in this golden era of Star Wars, but looking at the last 5 years and the slight trend downwards, I'd say we're probably in the waning years of that renaissance. While no big movies have been released, Star Wars has put out so many series, both animated and live action, that have kept the fandom afloat and alive. But the original nature of Star Wars was film, so I think Star Wars is probably on its way to actually waning without a new movie drop coming soon. Well, that concludes the specific fandoms I wanted to discuss. I did set up a dashboard for easy observance of other fandoms not mentioned. This provides the same information as my other analysis of work count by year, total work count, and timeline. So, for example, looking at Game of Thrones, we can see its metrics here. So, what can we take away from it all? We saw four different trends a fandom can fall into as a reflection of source material and media presence. Star Wars is in its renaissance. It's got a lot of new material coming to fans, which feeds the fandom and reflects how well the IP is doing IRL. Think the recent Star Wars celebration. Think Galaxy's Edge at Disney, and so on and so forth. Star Wars is bigger than it's ever been, and the fandom reflects that. Then we have Waning in terms of Supernatural. It's become a cult classic with lots of rewatchability, but the lack of new media means it's slowed down. There's not as much interest or hype to incite new watchers. And then we have revived fandoms, such as Lord of the Rings. Maybe it's just a small revival, but as is the same with long form or serial media, it inspires rewatches, which inspires new fans. New fans are incoming, but there's also the potential to fall off since seasons are being released with longer periods of inactivity in between. 2 years between seasons of 8 episodes doesn't lend to the same growth as Supernatural's 22 episodes every year. And finally, oddest of all, the zombification of fandoms like Harry Potter, wherein there's no direct reason for the growth, but the prevalence in media, the social implications around the work IRL, and the commodification when an IP like that gets enveloped by something bigger can all lend to a feedback loop of crazy growth. So, why did any of this matter? In tangible terms, it means money. If people love something enough to write 300,000 word fics about it, then it's more likely than not they're rewatching it, they're buying merchandise, they're visiting cons or parks or anything else. It's kind of a litmus test on popularity. In less tangible terms, however, it shows the dedication and effect of humans who just really love a good story. A lot of definitions for fanfiction use the word amateur as something bordering on derogatory. But amateur just means unpaid. It comes from the Latin word for to love. Creating new stories for the sake of it, for the pleasure of it, is just part of the human condition. Seeing how fandoms rise and fall speaks to the social nature of how we consume and deconstruct stories and how and when and why these stories inspire us even decades later. That's what's been meaningful to me, and that's the story I've hopefully told today. To end things, we have my sources and my gratitude. Thank you all for listening, and here's hoping you have a swell rest of your day.